So as we begin the session, I wanted to read a very short excerpt from an article that I came across in the New Yorker magazine in the last week or so, and maybe some of you have come across this as well. It reads, the Asian community's diversity reflects the fact that Asia describes a region with roughly 60% of the world's population. The median income of Asian American households is around $98,000, nearly $30,000 more than the American median. Yet, 8 of the 19 largest Asian groups have higher poverty rates than the national average. Their histories in the US vary widely. Nearly 3/4 of the Japanese American population was born here, which is the highest percentage among Asian groups. And in contrast, one of the fastest growing groups is Bhutanese Americans, more than 90% of whom are foreign born. I wanted to start out with this description because I thought it provided such a clear picture in some ways at a high level, at a macro level, of the huge range of Asian American identities that reside at the intersection of socioeconomic status, immigration status, race, ethnicity. And I would add that many of us experience shifts in these identities too, especially even within a generation, especially when your experiences are not quite or even close to what your own parents might have experienced. Um, and then we additionally account for our personal identities of gender, sexuality, disability, and so forth. Then the task of articulating who we are and our own true identities first to ourselves, and then being able to sort of exert that identity to address any misunderstanding, discrimination, or even misperceptions about privilege or actual um, perceptions of privilege to others can be that much more challenging. So with that, I wanted to introduce our 4 speakers here today who will be sharing their own journeys of self-discovery and all the critical intersections that form who they are. We're so grateful for their generosity and their courage for sharing their stories. And so without much further ado, we are so proud to welcome our panelists. They are Melissa Shang, Akriti Bombi, Lexi Chandra, and Crystal Kim. We are going to hear from them in this order. So I'm going to first open up the floor for Melissa. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you, everyone. So my name is Melissa Shang, and I am a 17-year-old at Newton South High School in Massachusetts. In English class this year, my teacher asked us about the significance of a name. My classmates of color said that their names tied them to their ethnic roots. My transgender classmates said that their names were their symbols of individualism. And my religious classmates said that their names made them feel more connected to their faith. At its core, a name represents an identity. My name is Melissa Shang. My first name, Melissa, is as American as can be. My last name, Shang, is more ethnic. It serves as the hub of centuries of culture and ancestry. You see, my parents are both first-generation immigrants from China. My mom grew up in Dongbei and my dad in Beijing. I, Melissa Shang, am a Chinese-American girl with a disability. I was born in Wisconsin, but I moved to Beijing with my grandparents at just a few months old to become more acquainted with my culture. When I was 2 or 3 years old, my grandparents started noticing that I wasn't walking as early as most children, nor were my fine motor skills at the level of most children. That's when they got concerned. They took me to see specialist after specialist to try shock therapy, acupuncture, and physical therapy, but no one could figure out what was wrong. Then, one summer, my parents took me to a neurologist in the United States. That's when I was diagnosed with Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, a form of muscular dystrophy. Growing up as a girl with a disability was hard enough as it was, but my heritage made it harder. In China, the subject of disability is seen as taboo and is colored with stigma and misunderstanding. When I was first diagnosed, my relatives blamed my diagnosis on my sister being too needy. If she hadn't begged my mom for a sibling, they said, I might have been born able-bodied. My parents blamed themselves. In China, there was a tradition to add a water sign to a name. Because mine had none, they said I was cursed with a disability. I now know that disability is nothing more than just a fact of life, or in my case, a genetic mishap. Still, the rumors remain. China places emphasis on the values of hard work, saving face, and striving for excellence. Chinese people frown upon the idea of needing help to achieve them, perceiving that as weakness, which leads to the perception of disability as lack of worth or incompetency. Instead of viewing people with disabilities as people with potential, the majority of Chinese people view them as people with flaws that need to be fixed. From that comes an unwillingness to set up disability rights legislation or accessibility standards. After all, if they aren't cured, then what's the point, right? People with disabilities in China are then homebound, isolated, and jobless, which seemingly validates the stigma surrounding disability and restarts the cycle. My parents put me in American schools knowing that the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 would ensure my rights so that I wasn't sucked into the cycle. Still, both my immediate and my extended family doubted that I would amount to anything in life. I didn't agree. At the age of 10 years old, I started a petition for the doll company, American Girl, to release a doll with a disability. The petition went viral, gaining almost 150,000 signatures and earning coverage on BuzzFeed, Cosmopolitan, Oprah Magazine, and even more. I went on to speak at the United Nations, do a TEDx talk, introduce Malala Yousafzai at the National Constitution Center, and I even wrote my own book in 2016, which was titled Mia Lee is Willing Through Middle School. Mia Lee has since sold hundreds of copies around the world. At the moment, my most important activity is my advocacy work with the Boston Center for Independent Living. Despite me breaking the cycle, the shame put upon me by my culture took a toll on me. For years, I felt that I had to choose between identifying as disabled and identifying as Asian American. I couldn't be proud of both when they clashed so much, could I? After a lot of growth and learning, I'm finally embracing my identity as a Chinese American girl with a disability. And I'm determined to crush stigmas and empower those with disabilities in both China and America. That said, each summer when I go to China, my relatives still ask me when I will be cured and mourn for me when I say that there is no cure as of now. I still get stared at on the streets. Children still ask their parents what's wrong with me. Although stigmas surrounding disability are still very much prevalent in Chinese culture and will very likely remain that way for a long time, I look forward to the day where Chinese Americans with disabilities like me will see liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much for sharing your story. We are going to hold our comments until the end, so we will move to Akriti next. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lois and Melissa. Thank you so much for being. You are so inspiring, and that was a really, really, really tough act to follow. I'm so grateful to be in community with everyone here, especially on this very incredible day where we officially have a new president in the US and the first ever woman VP, Asian American VP, daughter of immigrants VP. So it's a great, great day for our community. And I think that segs us perfectly into, I'll just quickly kind of talk a little bit about my background. And it's funny, in preparation for this panel, I spoke with Lois to kind of give her my background, and I noted that I started my story very specifically geographically. So I'm first generation. My parents moved here in the 80s from a small rural village in Punjab in North India. And so for most of my life, I've identified as Punjabi and Punjabi American. And so what I'm excited to kind of talk through with everyone here is like troubling out when and where we identify as Asian American versus not. And I've had a really complicated relationship with identifying as AAPI or Asian American. I think a lot about the ways in which Asian American and AAPI is a term that like was created before me. And so how I enter into that identification brings up a lot of questions. So a quick background, grew up in Central California, in an immigrant neighborhood, but a mostly white community outside. And so we were nothing other than other, right? And it wasn't until when I was in high school, actually applying to college, that I realized that I had to be very specific about my ethnic background. I was no longer just the other. I had to name specifically what it was. And I couldn't find me on it, right? So it lists the different ethnicities. And then I was going down the list, not white, not Black, not Hispanic. And then it said Asian American. And I thought, okay, well, geographically, Punjab is located in the large continent that is Asia. However, I've never, that doesn't seem right. So I bubbled it in because it's factual, but I didn't bubble it in because I actually identified with it. I did it for data, right? And so it was only when I started working in college, I started working with the Asian American diaspora, women particularly who were fleeing bodily harm, so survivors of domestic violence, refugees who were trying to kind of gain economic and cultural empowerment here in the US independently. That I started to see that our community is really a community that's much more diverse than I realized, right? And that more importantly, and the work I do now, so I work in politics and policy, just left the state legislature and now work as an advocate for the hospitals here in Massachusetts, and focus a lot of my work on racial justice and access to healthcare for communities of color. The reason I started to identify as Asian American is because I was empowered to do so because it felt like that was how our voice was amplified, right? So I think what gets really complicated, particularly when we are positioned within a system of white supremacy, is we're constantly having to name who we are, right? And we're constantly having to explain our histories. And I loved the fact that, and this conference is such a great example of it, I loved the fact that it was a collective of folks saying, hey, we come from this place, we have this story, and although there's diversity within us, we present a voice for change for us and among us. So I say that only to say that I'm curious to hear from the other panelists and the folks who are attending, because it's been complicated for me. And I think the last point I'll make on that one is just I think for South Asians, it has been more complex, our relationship with that identity, because representationally, when we see and think about who is Asian American and who isn't, it's typically East Asian, right? And so there are separate South Asian affinity groups, and then there's the Asian American group that tends to be more dominated in terms of leadership and face by East Asians. And we could talk forever about who created that and why that happens, and white supremacy is complicit in that for sure. But I say that only to say that these are just some of the thoughts that I have in my head, and I'll come back to this later. But a nugget I've been chewing on is it's really okay to not know yet exactly where you fit. And I'm 32 and I feel like I'm just getting that now. So to say that to everyone, that's part of the journey. So thank you so much for having me and hearing my story.
Thank you so much. All right, Lexi.
Can y'all hear me? Perfect. I'm going to start a timer because I'm really bad at keeping track of time. So I'm going to 5 minutes. So I first wanted to say thank you. I'm honored to really be here. I actually got here by way of my former school that I attended for my undergrad, and a group of students rallied around me getting to be here today on this panel. So I'm super appreciative. My name is Lexi. I use she, they pronouns. I identify as a mixed race, American Indian, trans, femme, non-binary person. Whatever that means in the historical context of this time, I am that. I wanted to name first and foremost that I found interesting this panel to be about intersectionality. And intersectionality is a term coined by a Black scholar activist, Kimberly Crenshaw, back 30 years ago, which was actually defined as a legal term, right? To understand overlapping forms of oppression, and now went viral, co-opted by white activists predominantly as well, to understand the ways that they can understand the world around them through an intersectional perspective. But it was coined by a Black femme a while ago. So I wanted to name that as well. My story is very interesting. A lot of who I became happened while I was in college during my undergrad. I did a lot of research on aging. I'm very interested in how folks age, why we age, how different individuals age differently than people. Age is a construct, and I tried to dive deep into that while in undergrad on campus in Connecticut. So while on campus, I did transnational research. I went to India. I launched an intergenerational contact program where I brought folks from a rural arts collaborative community to an old age home for over the course of 8 weeks to engage with each other through the arts, to talk about intergenerational contact and connection. Partly why I'm interested in aging and why I've always been interested in aging is because growing up, I was always surrounded by my Indian grandparents. My father is from North India. My grandmother is from North India. I know, right? And they came over to pursue opportunities. And while here, they also allowed me growing up to explore my gender identity. I remember wearing my grandmother's saris all across the house, dancing in her chappals, getting to understand my gender through her. However, over the course of my growing up, because of white supremacy and cultural norms, I had to leave that for myself. I could no longer participate in my femme fabulosity. I had to tone it down. I had to turn down the volume, and it was super difficult and super hard. So I intellectualized a lot of that while in college, did research in India, which I can talk about too in question and answer sessions if folks are interested, and then found my way to Brooklyn, New York to actually become program coordinator at an senior center for queer elders of color. So it brought all my identities together. I did that for a few years, was a program coordinator there. We had older Asian American individuals who were queer, and I got to work with them on programming, thinking about anti-Blackness in our communities and how we can name that as such, while also talking about white supremacy as a cultural norm that's often disguised in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we talked about all of those things. And then I found myself inside a hospital system, which is where I'm currently working for the New York City Health and Hospital System, to navigate queer, gender nonconforming, and trans patients through a healthcare system that is its own industrial complex. So we can talk about the healthcare industrial complex and how, especially for intersex folks, there's surgeries that are performed on a lot of folks as well in Asian communities who identify as intersex, and surgeries are performed non-consensually, and trans patients are also trying to get surgeries. So it's a matter of advocating for non-consensual surgeries to stop being performed on intersex folks, while also advocating for surgeries that trans folks are so desperate to receive. So I'm trying to juggle the healthcare industrial complex in both of my hands. I've also found quite interesting, I'm trying to figure out how much time I have left, about microaggressions in our community. There's different types of microaggressions that we experience, and we can also dive deeper into what that looks like for our intersecting identities in a little bit. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our last speaker, Crystal Kim.
Thanks, Lois. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crystal. I'm going to be sharing my story of intersectionality, growing up as an Army brat in an immigrant military family. Now, the word brat is an endearing term referring to children of military personnel. So my story is that my mother and father immigrated from South Korea to the States in the 90s. And I was the first in my family to be born here. And then shortly before 9/11, my father, then a pastor, joined the US Army to become a chaplain or a counselor, a religious leader for soldiers. And that's really when my family, our lifestyle entered a pretty distinct culture as we became non-civilians. I moved about 12 times before going to college in the South, both coasts, places in between. And my father was deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan 3 times. So at the core of my early life was impermanence, instability. And as the perpetual new kid in school, I closed myself off from making friends, especially because I was facing racism and sexism from my peers and teachers. I remember suppressing the anger bubbling up inside of me at how my family was making these sacrifices for our country. And that still never felt like enough to count as an American. So at home, my parents had incredibly high expectations for me and my sisters to excel academically, morally, spiritually, and to not forget our Korean roots. The biggest fear that I had growing up was that I didn't belong anywhere. Not in Korea, not anywhere in particular in the States. And over time, this manifested in me rejecting my Korean heritage, focusing compulsively on my academic performance, gaining an extremely negative body image. Since middle school, I struggled with disordered eating for about a decade. And younger Crystal, she really operated from a mindset of scarcity and inadequacy. She saw herself as someone who was inherently flawed, requiring fixing. I was a toxic perfectionist for so many years, and I saw myself as a side character in my own story. So this went on for a while, but fast forward to my last semester at Hamilton College, where I studied sociology and education. I enrolled in a women's studies course called Critical Intersectionality, taught by Dr. Margot Okazawa-Ray, a founder of the Combahee River Collective. And it was a transformative experience. Learning about intersectionality, it grounded me like nothing else had. For example, learning about the 4 I's of oppression, from ideological, institutional, interpersonal, internalized, it all helped me make sense of my experiences. And I was able to step back and accept that I wasn't an odd mishmash of fragments. I was whole. And so becoming an intersectional feminist really helped me take charge and become the protagonist of my own narrative. And I went on to do my master's in social justice and education at University College London, and then I began to work in the youth mentoring field. First at Big Sister Association of Greater Boston, and now at Apex for Youth in New York City, where I currently manage a mentoring program for Asian American and immigrant youth. And my dream one day is to become a counselor and support girls and women through transitions and trauma. I hope that my story highlights for you all that it's not only the demographic social categories that maybe you'll find on a form, but also your lived experiences, the hard to categorize stuff, the stuff you don't see on the surface that tremendously shapes your sense of self. And so growing up as a first generation bicultural Army brat meant that I would never have a zip code or a neighborhood to call my hometown, but along the way, I was able to find home within myself. Now I'm mostly just filled with gratitude for it all. And I'm at a point in my life where I've had so much more tenderness for myself. I love my body, I take care of it, I nourish it all. And intersectionality was a key driving force to my healing and growth, but it was also my sisters, my friends, mentors, therapy, yoga, just so many other things that helped me to believe in my worthiness, stop running away from my inner critic, and to begin dreaming really big for myself. I was able to sort of reimagine my future by better understanding my past with more compassion. So I hope you also feel empowered to examine your uniquely intersectional history and to trust that good things are headed your way. I wish you all so well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, yay. First of all, big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. So much. Thank you all for your deeply powerful, meaningful stories, for your journeys. for your advocacy and for your activism. We are so grateful. I know we have so much that we want to discuss and share. So I'm going to open up with one warm-up question for the panelists, and I would love for each panelist to just take take their turns to answer. And then I want to open this up to all the participants to sort of raise their questions. If you actually, I think the best way might be if you could type in your name in the chat if you wanted to make a comment or have a question, then I can sort of go through that list. I think that might work. So the question that I wanted to pose to our panelists is that clearly all of you have deeply reflected on your own identities and have been traversing this journey to really understand who you are and what you stand for. I wanted to, and all of us participating in this session, we are all at different parts of this journey as well. Some of us in the earlier stages, and some of us have a much more formed understanding. Just wanted to ask what or who has helped you to navigate and helped you to move forward in your journey to understand yourself better and to become who you are today. If one of the panelists could start out, or I'll give you a moment to think about it. Would anybody like to start us off? And think, yes, Melissa, thank you so much.
I think for me, it's my sister. Her name is Eva. She's 24 years old, and I think that like starting at a young age, it was my sister who taught me to stand up for myself and not just accept inaccessibility and accept ableism like as like just the way of society, and to really like fight against it. I remember that one of my first memories was in the 3rd grade when my teachers didn't allow me to go on a school field trip because I was disabled. My sister was the one who really encouraged me to like advocate for myself, and she helped me through that when I first started my journey. So I don't think I could do it without my sister.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melissa. And Akriti, were you raising your hand?
Yes. Thank you. So part of what's helped me get to the point where I feel comfortable and confident in identifying as Asian American is noting when we're erased, right? And I think there's a lot of shame that comes out of being erased. You're not grounded and confident in actually saying who you are, and it's a form of oppression. And so for me, someone who's helped me come into my own in this space and being vocal about it, he's actually a current state representative here in Massachusetts, but and he's Chinese American, grew up in Quincy at a time when Quincy was there's a Chinese American community there, but at the time it was smaller, and he is a leader in the Asian American community. And one of the things that he says often is, and I've adopted this too, it's like, and I challenge folks to think about this, when you're reading articles or watching the news or whatever it is, note when we are and are not named, right? And so when you look at the breakdown of racial data for something like how kids are doing academically or access to loans, you'll see white folks, and I'm not doing this as a way to compare, pit groups against each other. So I want to say that for sure. But I am saying this out of interest in amplifying our community. You'll see other racial groups listed, but we are so frequently left out. And it's really in like working with him over the years that, and he was shepherding in a bill on data collection here in the state that is yet to pass, but hoping it will. And he always says, where are we? And I love that question because it opens for me conversations about where have we been, where are we? And I think Crystal pointed that out so eloquently, like we don't have a zip code necessarily, but I think we're trying to find one. And I'm so excited about the community that's growing here in terms of confidence in the US to say Asian Americans exist. And I think we do this really interesting balancing act of naming ourselves as a larger community, and then to the point of this panel, also having the space and freedom to name those intersections. So I'm just grateful for that individual for kind of naming the thing that I've always needed to know, which is we're sometimes here, sometimes not, and that's not okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Akriti. Lexi, like to?
So I would say for me, a person or people who for me have been like guiding lights are honestly my elders. Being able to work with queer and trans elders of color at an organization in Brooklyn, New York, really provide a perspective for me on just the history of intersectionality, but also gender fluidity in Asian communities. I'm like, there's complete erasure of the fact that there's been ancestral connections to trans and non-binary, as well as gender non-conforming people in India, and not just in India, but in the Philippines, in some islander communities. It's just broad and deep in so many like lovely ways. So, you know, just being able to hear about and understand and dive deeper into Hijra identity in India, and how a lot of trans people in Asian communities have always been revered and respected. And in American communities, trans people are killed and murdered. And it's just like, where's this contradiction and why is it a thing? So to tease that apart and to also understand that, again, in a lot of like archaeological structures in Asian communities, in monuments, there's depictions of gender fluidity, but a lot of that through colonialism in India specifically had been erased, demolished. And that's why there's this unfortunate historical amnesia that exists within a lot of Asian communities when it comes to understanding intersectionality, but also gender identity, specifically. Very, you know, patriarchal system where folks like myself growing up were told to man up, not be a sissy, to think about restricting my movements to be more masculine presenting, really, you know, was not a one, like it did not provide me an intersectional perspective to understand how I can be in a world where other folks on this panel so eloquently said we're still whole. I think a lot of people are trying to break us apart, and that's what a lot of people who use intersectionality and weaponize it against folks try to like break people's identities apart. And the idea of intersectionality is understanding the wholeness of a person and how all of those identities can be still so simultaneous. So for me, elders, and there's a lot of queer Asian elders that are doing amazing work to educate folks in scholarly ways as well inside academic institutions.
Oh, so well put. Thank you, Lexi. Crystal, would you like to share any thoughts? And it's okay if you.
I'll add just, you know, very briefly that I like in terms of just self-education, reading and watching Kimberly Crenshaw speak, reading about like Chandra Mohanty's work, all of those, the people who have sort of paved the road to shedding a light on intersectionality, kind of birthing it in the first place. I know that's been a really empowering part of my journey. I'm always looking for more intersectional feminism reading for sure. But outside of that, I'd have to agree with what my other panelists have shared. You know, it's the people around me, my sisters, my friends and mentors who have held space for me to unpack some of my experiences in a safe and warm, non-judgmental space. So I'd say it's a little bit of that inner work, but also being willing to you know, put it out there and work through challenges with other people alongside them.
Thank you so much. And to all the participants, as Crystal has mentioned, thank you for being here so that we will be sure to share all the resources that are being mentioned here after the session. And also the group that you see here, the sisterhood that you see here is part of that support that you will have going forward. So, so we're celebrating that at this moment as well. And thank you again for the panelists. I'm going to turn this over to I'm sorry, we are running a little bit tight on time, but I do want to turn it over to the floor just to see if folks have comments, thoughts, questions that they would like to share. Okay, Lancy?
Yes, hi. I just have like a comment really. I just really enjoyed all of the speakers and the panelists. I think specifically what I'm going to say is kind of all of everything you guys have all said, but it's funny with Akriti, sorry if I said that wrong, but the whole South Asian thing, it's so funny. So I'm from Nepal actually. So I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal, but I was adopted and both my parents are white, but they're expats that live in Nepal. So I was around a lot of diplomats or different people like just sort of living in Nepal and army brats in some senses as well. But then I came here to the US, and I feel like that's really where I really realized what my identity was. And I did go to an international high school where it was pretty mixed. But then I came here and really saw the stark differences of just like how much segregation there is, and also how poor geographical knowledge and everyone. So my like just growing up in Nepal culturally is very similar to India and more similar to South Asia. It's considered South Asia, but I don't look but I don't look South Asian. And so the amount of just people again like asking what you are and then being like, no, you're not from Nepal, when I'm like, I'm telling you I'm from Nepal. I've definitely had and it's usually like I've definitely had people like, for example, like Uber drivers, for example, like this one Uber driver like sticks out specifically, but so I look more East Asian, and it's also because Nepal is like squeezed between China and India. So like it makes sense. Like it is a landlocked country. So I don't look like the majority of people from Nepal, but I'm literally from Nepal. But I've had this conversation with somebody in an Uber who was like, asked me where I'm from, the whole shebang over and over again. And I told him, and he looks at me and goes, no, you're not, as if he like knows. And I was like, I just told you where I'm from Nepal. And he goes, no, you don't look Nepali. And I was like, excuse me, like I'm from this world, like I know what it is. And he's just like, your skin is like lighter or some crap like that. And I was like, again, who are you to tell me where I'm from? So it's just such an interesting knowledge of, and then coming here and everyone assuming and didn't know where I fit in. Like I was like, culturally I'm more South Asian, but then I looked not. So then I kind of deemed this thing called a third culture kid too, which I'm sure many of us have heard, and just wanting to bring like level that up more and like have those talks more. That's sort of how I was able to find myself here and really understand my race as well and ethnicity, was by meeting other transracial or like third culture kids and like being able to talk this stuff out. And then also realizing how much I care about my Asian side too, since I've lived here. You realize that the other sense of belonging. Anyways, yeah, so everything encompassed in that. I just want to say it really resonated with me. So I'm really happy I was on this call.
Thanks so much for sharing. One of the things that I was reflecting on as Lanzi was sharing is sort of this perceived or preconceived notions of who we are when we confront various people. How do you navigate that? You are different than what someone who sees you, maybe what they, as an Asian American person may think of you. Have any of you panelists sort of confronted a challenging situation where you're dealing with somebody who has these okay, but before I'm going to hold my thought, there's a question here, so I'm going to read this. Did you ever find a situation where you had to choose one of your identity among your many identities, and how you overcame it? Thank you for that question, Lylene. Would anyone like to, yes, Akriti, yeah?
Unmuted. Yeah, quickly, just to respond to what Lancy had said, I feel like it's really important to communicate to non-immigrant communities in the U.S. When the question is posed, where are you from? Like that comes from a history where we have like forever been population controlled and not wanted, and so that history carries to today. So I just wanted to uplift that. And like, that's why that question's so painful, is that it comes from a lineage of not wanting us, and it's hard and it's shifted. And I think that there are people who are genuinely curious to know where we are from. But I want that education and that learning to really be done on behalf of, frankly, like America, to understand like kind of where that pain comes from. So I just wanted to make that point quickly. And then to answer what an interesting question around choosing your identity. What that brings up to me is privilege, right? And I carry great privilege relative to other communities. And I think about the fact I've got two younger brothers, and my youngest brother was actually pulled out of an airport and put in jail because he received aggressive. He's like me, we're a loud family. And so he kind of strutted into the gate, and the attendant, this is post 9/11, and the attendant called the feds and they took him away. He was literally boarding a flight to go home. And the privilege that I have there is I'm not male, right? And so I'm not a brown man. And so I'm treated differently, and I know that, and I try to honor and name that privilege. And so that's what the question brought up for me. I think it makes me, and truly your question's so good because it's an uncomfortable one, right? Like I get to be woman, identify as she, her, and with that comes a thing that my brothers will never get, right? And so I think to switch that and make it a force for good and a force for empowerment, I think what that question makes me think of is like, in the spaces where we do carry more power, use it for good, right? Like use it to amplify the stories of folks who don't have the ability to choose, or to navigate as neatly and as swiftly through those pieces of our identity as we do the work.
Thanks, Akriti. Next question is for Melissa, actually. Do you dislike being called inspirational, is the question.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very loaded question because there have been situations where people with disabilities like me have just been on the streets with friends, and someone's come up to us and called us you're such an inspiration to us. And then there's times where I'm actually doing a speech or being an activist, and then there are people who are like, your activism is very important, you're so inspirational. And I think there's a difference to that, because I don't think that people with disabilities are inherently inspirational for just living their lives in a different way than those people. But I think that when we're being an activist and we're speaking up for ourselves and we're doing stuff that actually makes us inspirational, just like anyone else, it's fine to be called inspirational. So I think it's just the way of thinking, where you need to think of, if this was an able-bodied person, if this was just like anyone else, in what context would I call them inspirational?
That's wonderful and really educational. Thank you, and helpful for us to know. There's one, I'm going to say this is the last question, unfortunately, that we can take for this portion of our session, and that it says, there's a lot of inter-Asian racism in Asia. For example, Indian versus Chinese, Korean versus Japanese, etc. How does that translate to your intersectionality experience and solidarity with other Asians here in the US? Great question. We are a big umbrella. Does anybody want to tackle that question?
Sorry, it's Lonzi again. I do have something to say to that. It actually happened here. So I'm from Boston, and I was quickly getting I was at like a little store, and I think it's run by a Vietnamese family. And I just, once I like got to like buy my things, the guy literally looked at me, and he just said, "Where are you from?" Like he didn't even like. And I was like, why are you asking? I don't really want to talk about this. But I was like, why? And he goes, "Are you Chinese?" And I was like, no. And I was like, excuse me, like, no, I'm from Nepal. And he goes, "Oh, Nepal. Okay, yeah. He's like, okay, yeah, they're also taking over your country as well. And I was like, okay. And then I was like, where are you from? Are you from China? Just to give him a dose of his medicine. And he was like, no, I'm from Vietnam. And I was like, okay. And I never went back there ever again in my entire life. I'm still not going to go back, but it's also just like that. It felt like a very strange thing I've never experienced before in my entire life, but I was also being categorized as Chinese for some random reason, but again, in a racist tone, as in like he all of a sudden knew who I was. Maybe I was, X, Y, and Z, and it was the first time I ever experienced that. And it's literally like down the street, but I never go back.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for sharing that. I think, would any other participants like to share some of their experiences? In my own family also, I have, grandparents who had lived through the colonial period in Korea, where we were under the colony of Japan. And I remember hearing story when I was little of sort of their experiences and of sort of the conflict between Japan and Korea, and that being reasons for not to buy certain things that are Japanese made, made in Japan, and things like that earlier in my life. And so there is something there that we have, some of us have experience with and have lived through. If yes, Akriti, yeah.
So I think the question's great. And also, I'm going to treble it a little bit to add some factors, complicating factors that are about generation and where you're asking the question, right? So the project of intersectionality within the API community can and truly only happen in a diaspora community, right? Which is to say, by and large, back home, we go back to the geographic identifiers very quickly, right? So I'm Indian, you're Korean, et cetera, et cetera. And we might intermix in terms of populations, but we're very staunch back home about where we're from. Here in the US, we have this incredible ability to kind of, especially for those of us who are first, second, third generation, we have a different relationship to our history and to what back home means. And so we have the flexibility to kind of like traverse geography and traverse identity in community. I think that what for me, the challenge is, how do I hold on to my roots while also engaging in this intersectional space, which is to say, and I think this brings me back full circle, I want to both be able to say that I'm AAPI and Indian American, and I want those to kind of carry the same weight. And that's what that's the work that excites me. So while it might be a challenge, I think that's the space and the mess that gets us closer to both who we are in our story, as well as who we are as a larger community.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes, go ahead, Otto.
My grandfather came here during the Vietnam War as a refugee, and he told me that when he came, he didn't expect that there were any Asian people here because he didn't really know what it was like. And he was just taken here, so he didn't really have any idea of what it was going to be like. So one day he saw a Chinese man in the grocery store, and he got so excited. He was thrilled to see that there was someone else who looked like him. So he walked over, and the Chinese man saw him, and he turned away. And he says that was really hard for him. And I've talked to some of my friends who are international students, and they said that the greatest racism that they've received is actually not from white people, but from Asian Americans. And I think that a lot of us just internalize a lot of this white supremacy, and that's how we ended up coping with a lot of our own microaggressions, because we just started removing those little bits of our Asianness, and that's not only reflected in ourselves but other people. So I had to become more aware of like what I was doing when my grandfather told me that, because yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Otto.
Hi, I just had a quick thought also, sort of related to what a couple other people were saying. I'm Leanne, by the way. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
So I am also adopted. I was born in China. My parents are white American. And I don't know what my specific like ethnic heritage is beyond just the continent of China and like the region where I was born. But I don't look like stereotypically like Han Chinese. My brother, who is also adopted, we're not biologically related, looks more like you would think of as like a, like an East Asian Han Chinese man. So from a lot of other Asian people, I've had a lot of the guessing game where they'll be like, oh, are you Malaysian or are you Vietnamese or whatever? And I'm just like, no, I don't really want to play this right now, but I just wanted to get my food, but that's fine. And then also when I was growing up, because again, sort of what Otto was saying, I'd internalized a lot of this stuff growing up in a predominantly white community and, going to a predominantly white elementary school, that when I then went to a bigger school with more diversity, I was having a hard time relating to a lot of the other Asian kids. And, we were all children, so you don't have the knowledge and, sociological perspectives that we have now as adults. But I really felt like it was really hard to make friends with them, or like they even wanted to make friends with me, regardless of what our specific cultural backgrounds were.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I can necessarily categorize that as, specific racism from any kind of ethnic group, but it definitely felt very isolating to be rejected by other Asian children.
Thanks, Leanne. This is really hard and but important thing that we're talking about and tackling here.
Hi, it's Kimberly Frank.
Hi.
I think I just want to piggyback on the conversation that Lonzi started with respect to the, what are you question, which is often asked of Asians or Asian Americans in communities where there is not a lot of understanding or acceptance of the ethnicity or the experience. And, that was my experience living in the Midwest for many, many years as a Japanese American. And so I wrestled constantly with the need to, with the understanding that I needed to educate. And yet some days I was just tired and I didn't want to educate. And I didn't feel like it was my obligation to educate, particularly when I could discern from the tone of the question. I got very good at this, discerning that the tone implied something like, what are you doing here? And why don't you go back to wherever you came from? Those three questions were never asked together, but the tone inferred the second two questions. And, when it was a child asking me, what are you? And mind you, it's a what are you, not where are you from, what's your background, what's your ethnicity, what's your heritage. It was never as appropriate as that, but it was always super inappropriate because it was asked in whatever context, any number of contexts, in the most sophisticated business setting to the Taco Bell line, And so I still wrestle with that in places that there's not good and significant understanding of and acceptance of people who are different. And, maybe the speakers could speak a little bit to the obligation to educate, or maybe not even obligation, their feelings about being asked to educate.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Would anybody like to? Yes, Crystal?
I think that was Kimberly. Thank you so much for sharing. And I really just want to acknowledge how dehumanizing of a question that is. What are you? Right? I guess in terms of the labor that goes into educating others, for me, it's always been a case by case situation. If I find myself in a scenario that is similar to what you were sharing, someone who kind of has a certain tone, doesn't maybe have the best of intentions, I will now decide to protect my energy and to not feel like any pressure to educate them, because I know that I'm only going to come out of that drained myself. And it took me a while to get there. And how I channel my energy is being excited to and conserving my energy so I can talk about things like social justice and intersectionality with the youth that I run my programs with. Every year I start off the program here with the workshop Identity and Intersectionality. And for me, it's really healing and moves me forward to have these conversations with young people. So a different kind of educational sense, because if it's someone that I walk into on the street that I've never met before, I'm going to approach that interaction quite differently than one of the teenagers who approaches me and wants to talk more about kind of something that they're going through with their sense of identity. So I would say it's depends on the situation for sure, and how much you want to delve into that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Akriti. Yeah.
And just to quickly add to that, for what it's worth, if anyone's struggling with this, no one person's theory of change or willingness to educate or not educate is the right way. And I think it can be overwhelming sometimes, especially, it sounds like this is a community of folks who are really deeply engaged in the justice work, to see kind of like a model or the loudest or like the most influential in that space and think that that's how you have to be. But I just hope that folks keep in mind that if you are the kind of person who does have the capacity to engage with non-Asian communities and educate, do it. If you don't, no worries, but that there isn't a one size shoe fits all for the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Great. Wonderful. Everyone, first of all, thank you so much for the speakers, and participants. Thank you for your active participation. Listening to the stories, I think they are powerful and they're meaningful to me because it's an exploration that they're sharing of how a person or a self becomes a self. We are articulating who we truly are, and that journey, and to understand how that's come about for these folks, and from there how we can even then further that journey by sharing that with others, becoming advocates, and even educating others. I think that it was so powerful for me to learn from and to hear. So we are very grateful. Thank you. Really appreciate it. If we could all give them one final round of applause as well. Great. Thank you all so much. So we will end the session here. We have now, as you see on the slide, 15-minute break, and we hope to see you at 4 o'clock, all of you. Thank you all.